Garcia. Garcia was always busy. Most evenings he'd be off at a local club in Marin or across the bay in Berkeley, playing with one of his bar bands. Garcia simply loved to play. His days were spent in mastering the pedal steel, and once in a while he would talk with me. From what Garcia was saying, it appeared that the Grateful Dead were in the midst of a conundrum. He hinted at musical issues that he was having with other members of the band, and talked a little about his old friend Ron Pigpen McKernan, the band's harmonica player and keyboardist, but it was all very elliptical. He told me how arriving at unexpected places was something of a speciality for the people in the Dead. Oh, well, we had something in common there. Jerry was not one to talk too much on a deeply personal level, but once early on we had a revealing conversation about our backgrounds. We sat in his back garden, rolled a spliff, and reminisced about our childhoods, filling in pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that made us who we were. We both shared a fascination with how people arrived at who they were. He asked me what it was like to be raised in a city that had been bombed. He wanted to know where I played when I was a child, what kind of toys I had, what my relationship with my adoptive mother was like. I told him about a friend of mine at school who lost his hand playing at a bomb site, and Garcia told me about losing the tip of his right middle finger as a kid in a wood chopping accident. I taught him a skipping song kids used to sing when I was in school. Little Johnny's got 2 stumps, got 'em at the ammo dump. When he went there out to play, the ammo blew his legs away. He found that very droll and admitted that he'd been ribbed at school about his missing fingertip. It was something that had stuck deep in his psyche. We talked about how children made light of the horrors of war and how music was used by the common people to answer and embrace every aspect of the human condition. I wanted to know what it was like to be raised in San Francisco, home to the Beats whom I so admired. What was it like to be a musician on the West Coast? As far as I could tell, they were treated with an almost unseemly reverence. What is it like, I asked Garcia, to have so many fans hang upon your every word? It sounded like a nightmare to me, and I sensed the man's frustration at having to endlessly point out that he was just a musician. We discovered that our grandmothers had essentially raised us both. Jerry's mum had struggled to get by when her husband had gone. My own mother had faced the same lonely struggle of widowhood. Jerry's mum had gone on to have relationships with men who Jerry didn't like, just as my own mother had married a man I couldn't stand. We were both sons who had carried some serious scars from childhood to adulthood. Strong and radical women had been involved in both our childhoods. My mother was a trade union organiser, and Jerry's grandmother had been an organiser for the Laundry Workers Union. Even more incredibly, his maternal grandmother's name was also Tilly. We were both truly amazed at the coincidence. The similarities in our childhoods were spooky. Garcia was what I would describe as a political progressive. He'd been raised in a union household and was familiar with the history of the epic strikes on the San Francisco waterfront. He had a basic respect for the values of ordinary Americans, and his attitudes were those of a good, solid San Francisco Democrat. A couple of hours spent sharing some California homegrown and discussing the formative experiences of a couple of lives, and we were in tune. We had both shared where we came from, and we had common childhood disappointments. We had transcended those childhoods and were now involved in other realities. That pleasant afternoon conversation formed the basis of my personal loyalty to Garcia. It was the only conversation about our respective childhoods we were to have, and it has remained with me ever since. Garcia was very hip like that. You could talk to him about something and he would ask questions, and thereafter that particular area of interest would never be directly addressed again. Once he received the information, he never forgot it. As soon as he understood how the Rolling Stones structured their arrangements as a band, he didn't bother to revisit that subject. When we talked about the early history of psychedelics in England, it was the same. He was vaguely curious about Pink Floyd, but once he'd heard the story of London in the 60s, that was enough. Tales of Blind Faith, Eric Clapton and Fleetwood Mac would only interest him insofar as they had bearing on his own experience with the Grateful Dead. His total focus when I first knew him was how his band could survive, pay its bills and keep body and soul together. Other than that, I'm not sure that Garcia was interested in anything else to do with the wider music business. On a drive together to the East Bay where Jerry was to play a gig with Merle Saunders, we talked about records and recording. Garcia gave me a potted history of the Dead's way of making records. In essence, he said the Dead had constantly been experimenting, trying to make a record that somehow sounded like them, and had failed. Even their live recordings hadn't captured their magic. The new Live Dead album had come close, but Warner Brothers had spent a fortune on supporting the band's effort, and they owed the label a lot of money. Thus far, not one of the records the Dead had released had actually made any real profit. In a word, they were broke, and had been since they began making records. The pressure to come up with a successful album was increasing. The band had to make a commercial record, or at the very least, a record that would recoup what it cost to make. The secret to this was slowly dawning on Garcia. Don't be profligate with studio time and keep recording costs as low as possible. Could the problem be not so much the recording of the various albums, but their marketing, I asked? How were the albums being sold? What kind of promotional coordination was going on between the album being released and the band's live appearances? Could it be something as simple as ensuring their albums were available in the record stores in a town where the Grateful Dead played? In the late 60s in San Francisco, very few people in the music scene were aware of this type of thing. The bands were concerned about album artwork and test pressings. Their interest in sales rarely strayed beyond the size of the advance they were to receive. The actual selling of records was something that was left to the record companies. It had the uncomfortable stench of commerce about it. Most of the people in control of the San Francisco bands were friends who'd been made tour managers, equipment managers and promo people. A certain type of inspired amateurism seemed to be the order of the day. Somehow the San Francisco bands felt more comfortable with friends as their managers, and as far as I could tell, the only ones who were managed in a strictly professional way were Creedence Clearwater Revival and Janis. Garcia was a big-hearted man. He had taken me into his house, and I was humbled by his generosity of spirit. He constantly thought of the welfare of others and naturally put the interests of the collective before his own. The Grateful Dead, I sensed, weighed heavily upon him. He felt so responsible for the problems they were having and was eager to develop a way forward. Sitting in his garden and listening to him talk about his music and how much he cared for his wider family took me back to my own upbringing. It reminded me in some ways of the commitment and passion of the people who had raised me, people who had seen the disaster of war and poverty firsthand and who knew that conflict and greed were no solutions to the problems of the world. Garcia had gone through the experience of the Haight-Ashbury, and he had retained a core commitment to the values that had been developed there. Now he was struggling to reconcile those values with the demands of the wider world. It all boiled down to the same old question: how was the band to survive?